we said that we would try to approach today with, starting today with the writers in exile, I think, and writers in prison. These were the two focal points, I believe, that you wanted us to go into.
But you wanted to briefly talk about the Armenian situation, didn't you?
Yes, yeah, we can touch upon this. Do you mean with regards to the recognition from Biden? And
right.
Yeah. I mean, how do you see that? I mean, obviously, I can sort of add my sort of thoughts to that, but without prejudicing your own. It would be interesting to hear what you think about that statement.
I'd been waiting for something like this for years. And I'm very happy that it now came, because the French were apparently the first to accept it, the term genocide. Before the Germans did, I had talked to somebody in the Turkish department, and they said, no, we won't do that. We cannot do this. The Armenians were killed, yes, but it was not genocide, and genocide in that term did not exist at the time that it happened. I was very, very defensive about that, because that was a cop-out. And so I'm all the more happy that now it has become worldwide, the recognition that the Armenian disaster was a genocide, and it has been accepted as such in history books and so on and so forth, except in Turkey, of course.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the questions that I've been asked. So just to essentially, I completely agree with everything that you said there. And being of Armenian ethnic origin doesn't in any way change that. It doesn't add to it necessarily either. So I think I'm more than content to hear and to agree with what you said there. People have asked me, though, going forward, what this could mean. And I find it's a fascinating topic, because with the USA recognizing it as genocide after 106 years, it doesn't change any facts for, I believe, the Armenians, because for them it had always been a genocide. There was no need for somebody else to tell them that was the case. However, the recognition for those who died, for the survivors, for those who tried to reestablish their communities in foreign lands, and I have to say, in the vast majority of the countries in which the Armenians ended up, so in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Kuwait, in Oman, in all of these areas, they were welcomed. They were given homes. They were treated with levels of humanity which they had not experienced up to then. And indeed, I was even shown once a decree from an emir stating that it is the responsibility of Arab peoples to take in the Armenians. And this was sort of published at the time. And so for Armenians, the act of recognition by the USA is an extremely welcome gesture. And so the question regarding what therefore should follow is difficult to assess, because
it is. Absolutely, because we don't know what will happen with Turkey, within Turkey, and that's part of the problem. The fact that the Arab countries accepted Armenians had also something to do with their enmity or distance from the Ottoman Empire. And they had been under the Ottoman Empire themselves in parts. So to me, it was natural that there would be an acceptance. It was unnatural to me that the acceptance of the term genocide was procrastinated in Western countries, in Europe, and until now in America. So I'm very happy that there has been a stone rolled over.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we're still hoping for the boulder. I believe that the normality can come to pass in that area once mature politicians on both sides decide to step up and take responsibility for their people. And they should engage in dialogue. There's no reason why, after all of these years, there should be no dialogue. And I'm hopeful
Between
this
who?
will change. Between the Armenians, between the Turks. And I think there should be a pathway towards recognition by Turkey for the crimes committed by the Ottomans. We're not talking about the new country that was founded by Ataturk. We're talking about the Ottomans.
Right, right.
And they should recognize this historical fact. But that can only happen with official dialogue with the representatives of the Armenian government. And as I said, I do believe that requires mature politicians from both sides.
And independent politicians, I think, also on the Kurdish side. The Turks, Erdogan, is on a war path against Kurds of every kind, and it was the Kurds that I met in the last 20 years who always stood up for the Armenian people, while during the Ottoman Empire they were among the military forces of the empire against the Armenians. So there has been a change because the Kurds have now also been on the receiving end of oppression and lack of independence. So I think there should be room for a tripartite conversation and negotiations, but that would necessitate that Turkey would not just accept the Armenian genocide, but also the displacement of the Kurds and the obsession with getting at their throat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, the Kurds were. You've already said it. I'm not going to repeat what you said, but essentially the Kurds were tricked, were conned in those days during the First World War, when they were told by the Ottomans, if you help us in this, we will create for you that which you have always desired. And they helped them in the massacring of Armenian villages and assisting in the deportations that followed. And then they themselves were attacked by Ottoman soldiers. They were refused, they were vilified. And this is why these issues continue to exist between Turkish government representatives and indeed representatives of the Kurdish communities. The Kurds have been unfairly treated throughout the Middle East. I mean, it's not just in Turkey, it's also in Iraq, you could say.
Of course.
And, there needs to be, some kind of resolution to the Kurdish question. But when you see, for example, that the Kurds who are so complimented for the assistance that they provided for the, shall we say, this war against ISIL, or Daesh as they call it at the time, by the West. And then for the West to simply turn their backs on those forces they had complimented so vehemently and then left them for the Turks.
You're taking the words out of my mouth. That's what I was going to refer to next. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't want to jump in there.
No, we're on the same side, and we're thinking the same, and we have the same perspective on what is going on right now. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think, and it's perhaps it's just naivety on my part, but I would like to think that had Mr. Biden been president at the time, he would not have allowed that to happen to the Kurds. I think it was Mr. Trump was basically, we won, we got rid of them, and yeah, I'm sorry, but I don't want to have, I don't want to engage any more conflicts with American troops. You guys take care of yourselves. And for any country to make that kind of decision, it's suggestive of cowardice, really.
Right. It's 4 years that we have to get through now, probably the next 10 years, and eradicate everything that was done wrong during those 4 years of Mr. Trump, ex-President Trump.
Yes, indeed. Yes. I mean, I don't know where that particular story will end. But I mean, for as long as we see people in power who, I agree that there is a right for right-wing politicians just as much as there is a right for left-wing politicians to exist. I don't understand why they have such little regard for human life.
Yes.
As in, be right-wing. As a person who believes in democracy and says you have the right to your opinions, be right-wing. But why do you kill innocent people? I do not understand this element.
This is what we've been working with in PEN, in many organizations, which has been on my mind and in my thoughts and in my heart and in my efforts to counteract it for 20, 30 years now, on a very small scale with regard to those who opened their mouth against injustice, against corruption, against war. And this is where Writers in Prison and Writers in Exile comes in. Writers in Prison is the work for people in their country when they are oppressed, when they're under threat of being killed, of being thrown into prison. And this is worldwide. And at the same time, during the first 10 years of working for Writers in Prison, or maybe the first 5-6 years working for Writers in Prison, the question was not just in my mind, but in everybody's mind who was working for Writers in Prison. What do we do with writers that we can free from oppression and bring into other countries? What are the means that we can provide for their livelihood, for their forum to step out as a writer and continue what they had been taught and what they had been doing all their lives? So the Writers in Exile efforts came right out of the Writers in Prison efforts. And for me, it turned me back into, or got me back into the early years when I was living among exiles. And so I could link up to the feeling and the oppression and the aftermath and the trauma of exile, so that I could bring in into the efforts of first German PEN some information on what was needed. The only problem was not very many people knew anything or how to deal with exiles. We had an international effort to start an international exile committee or network, which failed because some people were taking the money and run. Then German PEN with the President Said, as I said before, the first non-German president of German PEN, we were sitting in Moscow and were looking at discussions, and Said said, we have to do something. How can we step up and help Writers in Exile? And our Writers in Exile vice president didn't know very much English. She was very good in Russian. So Said turned to me and said, Karin, you tell them we are taking over as clearinghouse for the Writers in Exile Committee or network. Everybody was very happy and grateful. So in the end, I ended up as the non-official representative of the German clearinghouse for Writers in Exile, and got involved right away by researching what the differences were in different countries and different regions of the world, how they dealt with exiles in general, were they giving asylum, were they providing for their livelihood when they came in. And it depended on the country and the region. The European countries were very much against offering asylum. You had to go through the process with everybody else, which, of course, for writers is very difficult because they cannot be in contact with their colleagues in Western countries and say, you know, what are you doing for us? Can you not help? So we decided in Europe that the only way of giving them a secure way of living in the countries that of the European community was to find scholarships for them, scholarships that would give them money and insurance and particularly money to live, to be able to write. And this was our main concern. Of course, we couldn't do it for umpteen hundreds and thousands of people, but German Pen was lucky. We got money from the government for 6 scholarships in 6 different cities, so that we had a network of people who we dealt with, and in every one of the cities we had someone to take care of them, to go to through the official process of registering them and finding a place and finding later ways of getting them on a podium so that they could present themselves as writers, which of course is very difficult when there is no connection between the languages. People who came from Iraq, of course, didn't know German, so we needed translators. We needed people to understand what was going on in an exile, in an exile's mind, particularly in a writer's mind. And I was thinking of the research I'd done on German exile in the United States. And there the general feeling was the older people would never learn the new language. It was only the younger people who had a chance of writing in the language of their host country. So it would always be an exile situation for most of the writers. And realizing that we tried as best we could to find venues and people to help the writers that came into our lives. I'm talking about Germany now. With 6 scholarships, there were several cities in Germany who also established their own scholarships, and they aligned themselves with Pen. So if they had a free space, we looked in International Pen what we could do and where we could help. The other situation this was pretty much the same situation in all countries in Europe. We needed scholarships because we needed money for them to live, whereas in America and particularly in Canada, the situation was when anybody came into the country, they were helped with basics, and they were assisted in their different professions, but they, within fairly short period of time, they had to sustain themselves. With the help, of course, of writers' unions and writers' organizations, they weren't falling into a bottomless pit. But the situation in Europe, particularly in Germany, was very favorable. And we had another positive aspect. We had friends who were doing the same. There was the city of Hamburg, who was taking in exiles and people under stress and under government oppression. The city of Graz was taking in people. The Parliament of Writers, where the first president was Salman Rushdie, they had established a network of exile cities, and this network later was taken over by Stavanger in Norway, and the Stavanger network was very, very strongly supported by the government in Norway, and they, in a way, took over many of the services that an exile committee would do. Basically, International PEN right now does not have a Writers in Exile committee or a Writers in Exile network. They have conferences inviting those countries with writers in exile, Norway, Sweden, Germany, and quite a number of others. Plus, they are very, very closely working together with Stavanger and the international network of cities of refuge. Those were the efforts that came parallel to the Writers in Prison work, and it worked very well because we could network with the cities and countries working for writers in exile, because they were also, in a way, working for writers in prison. And it was easier than when I began to find international connections and find international support, which, as I stressed over and over again, is the only thing that really helps, because we need the strength of the voices of freedom to convince anybody and to convince oppression, to convince countries of oppression that they should give writers the freedom to speak their mind, and see to it that freedom to speak, freedom to write, and freedom to publish are maintained, is something that they won't do anyway, even if however loudly we scream, if there is no reason for them to do it. And that is the most difficult aspect of writers in prison, as well as writers in exile. Because writers in exile also depends on getting people into the country. When we had problems, sometimes we had promised a scholarship to somebody in Africa, and we had problems with German embassies to let them in, because they were saying once they got in, they will ask for asylum, which was sometimes and most of the times true. But what do? You can't just pick those where you are absolutely sure they go back. And in many cases, they couldn't go back. They would have been killed. So it was always a balancing act. And it remains a balancing act, writers in prison as well as writers in exile.
Yeah, I mean, I find it challenging in some ways to understand, because the European Union is very much based upon upholding these ideals of freedom of speech, supporting these democratic principles in other areas. And so therefore, having these principles means inherently that you will do all that you can to uphold those voices in other cultures, in other languages, to assist them, essentially. I don't agree with the policy of exporting democracy or democratic principles to areas where they do not want them, because I don't think you can force freedom upon a culture.
You cannot. No.
It doesn't make sense. On the other hand, if there are voices of freedom within, there must be some kind of peaceful dialogue that can be had with perhaps the government from an official representative of the European Union. But then again, as you say, there should be a responsibility of recognizing the plight of these people and accepting them within the European Union as a cultural voice.
I must say that we had very good support from the European Union whenever we approached them. As I had said during the trial of Orhan Pamuk in Istanbul, there were 4 people from the German delegation of the European Parliament. They were at the trial as observers. So there is an effort in many parties, not all of them, to help sustain the dialogue with those who are in exile. The only problem is that's expensive. And the expense is what keeps many countries away from even touching the problem. To invite somebody into the European context where asylum is political asylum, yes, but it is asylum on a very, very low level of help. If you have asylum, you are thrown into with the lowest denominator of employees. What we were trying to do for the writers was to establish their base for being able to continue writing, and maybe even while learning the new language, being able to later, maybe in 20 years, to approach the public in that country in their own language, which was a hope. It's not feasible in most cases, but writers are the first who are thrown to prison, threatened with death when they open their mouth. And that's the profession of writers, is to write, to open their mouth, to look at the society around them, and to point to the things that are missing. So they're the first victims of oppression. And that helped us, or that led us to feel that they needed special help. And to this day, I think a voice that is being crushed wherever, whether in foreign countries or by lack of financial or whatever base in the country of exile, is a voice lost. So my feeling is that we should still work on both fronts, but to provide somebody with a livelihood, particularly when they have come with wife and children, they need an apartment, they need furniture, they need insurance, particularly health insurance, they need household insurance, and they need some money to live on, because they cannot provide for themselves. The publishers that they had been dealing with, if they had had any, and many had paid for their own publications, They're gone. They can reach them better now than writers about 50, 60, 70 years ago. That's true. But the contact of an Arab writer to a Lebanon publisher is very limited. And this is true for other countries. The support for writers in exile is, as I said, expensive. It should not be too expensive for us, rich countries. It is very helpful what PEN, and this is since that is the organization I was most familiar with, what PEN is doing in many, many areas to help them get out of the country of oppression or stay in safe places in their country or come to Europe or come to anywhere outside is possible. And some countries, some people, some colleagues had wonderful ideas of getting money to help writers in prison and writers in exile. And I think we are intelligent, we are creative people. We should think about 1,000 ways of supplying what is needed for those who are in exile and are under oppression, because it may happen to us one of these days.
Yeah, a very an important point to raise. Out of curiosity as well, the writers, for example, that come to countries such as Germany, are they united with the communities of the ethnic communities of these countries? I mean, so for example, if you have a Kurdish author who has escaped persecution and who arrives in Germany, would this writer have access to the local Kurdish community? Would they want to have access? As in, there would be a relation. Okay.
Of course. The problem is people who come into exile are very, very cautious as far as political alliance is concerned. And a Kurd who comes from Turkey may not necessarily be very happy about aligning himself with a Kurd who is close to the PKK or any other organization. So it's a political question. Many people who come find ways of getting together with people of their own country and their own culture, particularly. In some cases, they didn't want any contact. So their contact was or stayed outside of the realm that we could give them access to. And so they had to fend for themselves. But in many cases, these, I would call them former exiles, who were helped through these programs. There's a very strong Bangladeshi element who are working for against oppression and for freedom in their country, and they're in Europe, stayed in Europe, connected themselves with like-minded friends. And you have that as one example of many. So the hopeful and the positive aspect of it is not just that those writers add to the liveliness, the colorfulness of our culture, which is something everybody forgets because, they're strangers. How can they serve us? They are part of international culture. We are part of international culture. The cultural movements are getting in part away from nationalistic or ethnic cultural movements, while the ethnic culture should be maintained. The access through literature is multifaceted and it's worldwide and should remain that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thoughts that certain cultures possess, which go back centuries or millennia, cannot simply be dismissed on the basis that they were originally pronounced in another language. The value, as you say, the beauty, the intrinsic importance of some of the meaningfulness of these terms, of these stories are wonderful. I came across a very simple sentence not long ago, and I believe it was an old African proverb that says, "It takes a whole village to raise a good child."
Yes.
And I mean, for me, the meaning, the depth of that simple sentence, it's very difficult simply to fathom in a superficial way. As in, you'd have to sit down and really think about what that means, and it's wonderful as a proverb. The meaning of it is amazing.
Yes. On so many levels, because it takes a world to shape every individual life.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I often do get a sense that the further back in time that we go to find communities and expressions, the more human the essence is, and the more we perhaps crave it, because right now, especially when we are hiding behind our technological devices to have any kind of communication and relationship with the outside world, we miss that humanitarian element. The humanity of our interactions are not there on a daily basis as they once were. And so the meaningfulness of these sentiments are far more pronounced, I find at least.
I know what you mean. I'm not quite sure that this has something to do with former cultures or cultures that are gone or are going away. It's a part of our new thinking that is formalistic, technical, and at the same time, what would we do without technology? What would we do without formalism? But we should not import it into culture. When literature is interpreted only according to its formalistic aspects, there's something missing. The most important thing is missing. I had an example from a young lady who is 14, 15. Her German teacher was teaching her and her class the formalistics of poetry. Terms that I'd learned during my studies, but not when I was 14. The only question I asked afterwards was, and what are you doing with the contents? How have you spoken about the contents of poetry, for instance? This is the question that the overlaying of formalism over humanity and makes the differentiation of all kinds of aspects of culture, makes it so difficult to get back to the human element. And there you are very right.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's essentially what I was trying to identify. It's I was trying to remove this the technological element and putting the individual, let's say, reader on this in this example, in direct contact with the writer, the sentiments of the writer, and trying to then understand almost face to face within the imagination that then comes through the process of reading, and trying to understand the relationship that the author, even if you go back hundreds and hundreds of years, still today has with the reader. I do find that transmission fascinating.
Yes.
I have to admit.
The only problem is our school system has not given the priority to culture and to literature, but to so-called facts and items. They don't pull it together and say, look at all these different aspects. What are you making out of it? Or what has somebody else made out of it? One is the analysis and one is the synthesis. And I'm all for analysis. I'm all for technology. I'm all for formality, whatever. But if you don't pull it together and synthesize what you analyze and what you break apart, you lose. And this is why I totally agree with what you said. We have lost that contact.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, this is also something which, as you say, synthesizing. We can expand the principle into other areas of our, societies, communities, our lives. Essentially, we can analyze immigration. We can analyze integration. We can analyze all of these different processes and come up with lots and lots of different statistics and studying, what is best, what is perhaps not so good, and so on. But there is an inherent beauty also within diversity. And, sometimes the problem isn't the diversity itself. The problem is the inability to embrace that diversity.
Yes.
And I think, it's good to find a way where you can accommodate groups and accommodate different needs and interests. But the overriding factor should still be, we must embrace our differences and find a way.
And sometimes you find the answer to something like this in a poem, in a verse, in a line from a novel, thought and written by somebody 2,000 years ago. And that to me is breaking through the formality, breaking through the limitations, breaking through the fractionizing of our world. You break through back to the basics. And I think that's what we should all learn. We shouldn't learn it in old age when you can't give it to anybody around you anymore. But we should learn it from the beginning. And there, I think the school systems are completely going into the wrong direction, except for maybe the occasional wonderful teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm going to make a note of this because education, I have a bit of a problem with the direction of education. And I want to give education a chance. I want to speak to some people, some current teachers, and see what their thoughts are. But I'd love to go into a bit of a discussion about that as well with you in one of our future episodes. We've got so many things to discuss, Karin. I've made so many notes about what we're going to discuss in the future. I think we should probably have a chat about that. But yeah, owing to our allergies, I think we'll leave this as our shortest to date podcast, short and sweet one. But yeah, thank you very much. I do really appreciate the deep sentimentality of the way that you have approached your work, and also indeed the message that you give out today. There is a definite strength and power to the message that you give. So thank you for that, Karin.
I thank you for giving me the time. And right now, I think we better stop because my voice is starting to go.
Okay, all the best. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.